What if General Patton's greatest enemy in March 1945 wasn't the German Wehrmacht, but his own Allied command? On the night of March 22nd, Patton launched a rogue, unauthorized crossing of the Rhine at Oppenheim. No artillery, no air support, no approval from Eisenhower, Montgomery, or SHAEF. It was an act of pure insubordination that should have ended his career. It didn't. Why? Because Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, worked tirelessly behind the scenes to protect him. What exactly did Bedell Smith do? And how did he save Patton from court-martial? The strategic landscape of Western Europe in early March 1945 was dominated by a bitter debate over how to deliver the final blow to Nazi Germany. Under the strict directives of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Montgomery's British 21st Army Group was designated as the Allied main effort. Montgomery's planned Operation Plunder in the Lower Rhine region was a massive, highly methodical, multi-divisional assault scheduled for late March 1945. To ensure its success, the G4 logistical branch of the Supreme Command, tightly controlled by Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, funneled the vast majority of Allied fuel, landing craft, and tactical bridging equipment to the north. This systemic rationing left Lieutenant General George S. Patton's U.S. Third Army operating under severe administrative constraints, with its fuel allocations capped and its engineering assets earmarked for transfer to support the British offensive. Patton interpreted these bureaucratic restrictions not as sound logistical planning, but as a deliberate political conspiracy orchestrated by the British High Command to deny American forces the glory of breaching the German heartland. Recognizing that an explicit request to cross the Rhine would be summarily rejected by the Supreme Command's cautious planning staff, Patton initiated a covert campaign of administrative circumvention. Behind the scenes, he instructed his Chief of Staff, Major General Hobart Gay, and his engineering officers to systematically stockpile assault boats, pontoon units, and heavy construction equipment. These critical supplies were quietly amassed during the Third Army's rapid advance through the Saar-Palatinate region, carefully hidden from the prying eyes of the Supreme Command's logistical inspectors. Patton's engineers went as far as creating shadow supply ledger entries, mislabeling naval landing craft as defensive fortifications to prevent their requisition by Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith's staff. This administrative deception created a ticking clock. If the Supreme Command discovered the unauthorized stockpiling before Patton could execute a crossing, the resulting insubordination charges could permanently strip him of his combat command. Patton's operational gamble found a silent yet powerful co-conspirator in Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, the commander of the U.S. 12th Army Group. Bradley had grown intensely frustrated by what he perceived as Field Marshal Montgomery's patronizing attitude toward American commanders and the Supreme Command's apparent willingness to subordinate American initiative to British strategic demands. Although Bradley was a stickler for the formal chain of command, the sudden, unexpected capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7, 1945, by the U.S. First Army radically altered his bureaucratic calculus. The Remagen crossing proved that the Rhine could be breached opportunistically, forcing Eisenhower and Walter Bedell Smith to retroactively validate a highly irregular, unplanned operation. Bradley realized that if Patton could pull off a similar coup further south, it would decisively validate the American broad front strategy over Montgomery's single-thrust model. Under this shared conviction, Bradley verbally greenlit Patton's aggressive push toward the Rhine, offering tactical cover while deliberately withholding the details from Eisenhower's chief of staff. This covert operational planning occurred against the backdrop of a fierce bureaucratic civil war within the Supreme Command's administrative apparatus. Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith was locked in a bitter struggle with Lieutenant General John C.H. Lee, the powerful and logistics-obsessed commander of the communication zone. Lee, who controlled the physical flow of all supplies from the French ports to the front lines, had established a highly centralized bureaucratic empire that often operated independently of the Supreme Command's direct oversight. Smith was determined to rein in Lee's autonomy and enforce strict compliance with Eisenhower's strategic directives, which prioritized Montgomery's northern advance. Consequently, any unauthorized diversion of fuel or heavy bridging assets by Patton's Third Army was not merely a tactical infraction. It was a direct threat to the fragile administrative balance Smith was fighting to maintain. Had Smith discovered that Patton was actively hoarding resources with Bradley's tacit approval, He would have been administratively compelled to halt the Third Army's advance to preserve the integrity of the Allied command. By mid-March 1945, the rapid collapse of the Palatinate pocket handed Patton the operational opening he had been desperately seeking. As the German 7th and 1st Armies disintegrated under the combined weight of the U.S. 3rd and 7th Armies, Patton's forces surged toward the western bank of the Rhine, capturing tens of thousands of demoralized prisoners. This rapid advance created a critical strategic dilemma for the Supreme Command. Under existing directives, once Patton cleared his sector west of the Rhine, he was supposed to establish a defensive posture, halt his advance, and yield his logistical surplus to support Montgomery's imminent assault. Patton knew that if he stopped, his precious fuel and transport trucks would be instantly confiscated by Walter Bedell Smith's staff and redirected to the British 21st Army Group. To prevent this logistical death sentence, Patton resolved to cross the river immediately, presenting the Supreme Command with a fait accompli that they could not administratively reverse. The site selected for this high-stakes gamble was the Oppenheim-Nierstein sector, roughly 10 miles south of Mainz. This stretch of the Rhine offered favorable high ground on the western bank for artillery observation, but the flat, exposed eastern bank meant that any established bridgehead would be extremely vulnerable to German counterattacks if not reinforced with extreme speed. The operational constraints were immense. Patton's spearhead, the U.S. 5th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General S. Leroy Irwin, had to execute a night assault without the benefit of a preparatory artillery barrage, ground smoke screens, or airborne support to maintain absolute tactical surprise. This meant the success of the entire operation hinged entirely on the combat engineers of the 249th and 1135th Engineer Combat Groups. These men had to transport heavy, noisy steel pontoon equipment and motorized assault boats down congested, muddy roads to the riverbank in pitch darkness, completely undetected by both the German defenders and the Supreme Command's aerial reconnaissance. On the night of March 22, 1945, the first wave of the 11th Infantry Regiment, 5th Infantry Division, quietly slipped their canvas assault boats into the cold, swift waters of the Rhine. The crossing was executed with an eerie, calculated silence that stunned the few German defenders on the eastern bank. Unlike Montgomery's meticulously planned northern crossing, which was preceded by a devastating 5,000-gun artillery barrage and massive strategic air bombardment, Patton's assault was launched with zero pre-landing gunfire. The tactical surprise was absolute. The German 159th Volksgrenadier Division, severely depleted and expecting a feint further north at Mainz, was completely caught off guard. Within hours, the initial assault waves had secured a tenuous foothold on the eastern bank, suffering fewer than 34 casualties. Yet as the sun began to rise, the tactical success of the crossing only heightened the strategic danger, as Patton's forces now sat exposed on a flat floodplain with no permanent bridge to bring across the heavy armor needed to repel an inevitable German counterattack. Early on the morning of March 23, 1945, Patton called Bradley at his 12th Army Group headquarters to deliver the explosive news. "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across," Patton whispered into the secure field telephone, eager to keep the operation secret from the Supreme Command until the bridgehead was fully consolidated. Bradley, sharing Patton's desire to secure an American victory before Montgomery launched his massive, highly publicized assault, received the news with immense satisfaction. However, both commanders knew that a fragile infantry bridgehead was not enough. They desperately needed heavy engineering assets, specifically pontoon bridging material and heavy M2 treadway bridges, to transport the 4th Armored Division across the river. This requirement presented an immediate administrative crisis. Patton's engineers had already consumed their localized supplies and needed to draw heavily from group-level reserves. Doing so would inevitably alert the G4 supply officers at the Supreme Command, who were bound by strict directives to preserve those exact resources for the northern offensive. The Germans quickly recovered from their initial shock, and by midday on March 23rd, the Luftwaffe launched a desperate, concentrated air campaign to destroy Patton-constructed pontoon bridges. Waves of German fighters and bombers targeted the Oppenheim crossing, seeking to sever the lifeline connecting the vulnerable American infantry on the eastern bank with their support structure. American anti-aircraft gunners and the fighter bombers of the 19th Tactical Air Command put up a ferocious defense, knocking down dozens of German aircraft in a series of chaotic dogfights directly over the river. Despite the aerial onslaught, U.S. Army combat engineers worked tirelessly under intense fire to maintain the integrity of the treadway bridges. Patton watched the unfolding crisis with a mixture of pride and acute anxiety. He knew that if the German counterattack succeeded in isolating his forces on the eastern bank, the tactical triumph would instantly turn into a strategic catastrophe, leaving him entirely exposed to severe disciplinary action from the Supreme Command. By the evening of March 23rd, with the bridgehead successfully holding against the initial German counterthrusts, Patton realized he had to act fast to protect his achievement from administrative sabotage by the Supreme Command. He called Bradley back with an urgent, dramatic demand. "For God's sake, tell the world we're across. I want the world to know Third Army made it before Monty starts across." Patton understood that the only way to shield his unauthorized move from Walter Bedell Smith's bureaucratic wrath was to enlist the ultimate ally, the Allied press corps. By broadcasting the news to the global public, Patton would make it politically impossible for Eisenhower to order a withdrawal or starve the Third Army of logistics. Bradley agreed completely and immediately drafted an official press release, carefully timing its dissemination to maximize media impact and directly preempt the carefully choreographed British publicity campaign for Operation Plunder. The public announcement of the Oppenheim crossing hit Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force like a lightning bolt. Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith was reportedly furious when he read the news, recognizing immediately that Patton and Bradley had deliberately bypassed the established chain of command and violated the Supreme Command's strategic logistics directives. Smith, whose chronic stomach ulcer was aggravated by the constant stress of managing the coalition's internal friction, viewed the unauthorized crossing as an act of intolerable insubordination that threatened to disrupt the delicate coordination of the entire Allied offensive. He immediately demanded a full accounting of the fuel and bridging assets used by the Third Army, intending to launch a formal administrative investigation into the diversion of supplies. Smith faced a daunting challenge. He had to maintain the integrity of the command structure while preventing a public, highly toxic political rift between the American and British high commands that could severely damage the war effort. Meanwhile, in the northern sector, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and Prime Minister Winston Churchill were preparing for what they believed would be the defining moment of the Western campaign, the launch of Operation Plunder on the night of March 23rd. Churchill had already pre-recorded a triumphant speech congratulating the British forces on executing the first successful assault crossing of the Rhine in modern history. However, due to a highly embarrassing administrative error by the British Broadcasting Corporation, the pre-recorded speech was broadcast to the world even though Patton's Third Army had already been firmly established on the eastern bank for over 36 hours. The resulting diplomatic embarrassment was acute. The British High Command was deeply mortified, perceiving the premature broadcast and Bradley's sudden press release as a calculated, nationalistic insult designed to diminish the scale of Montgomery's highly prepared offensive. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower found himself caught in a paralyzing political crossfire. On one hand, he was genuinely thrilled that the Rhine had been breached at another point with minimal casualties, as it significantly accelerated the destruction of the German Wehrmacht. On the other hand, Eisenhower was acutely sensitive to the political realities of the coalition, knowing that any perceived American effort to upstage the British contribution could cause a severe rupture in the combined chiefs of staff. He had spent months carefully balancing the massive, fragile egos of his subordinate commanders, and he knew that Patton's latest stunt threatened to undo all his diplomatic efforts. Eisenhower needed a way to exploit Patton's tactical success while officially maintaining the integrity of the Allied chain of command and placating the furious British leadership. To resolve this crisis, Eisenhower turned to his trusted chief of staff and political shield, Walter Bedell Smith, charging him with the task of sanitizing the entire operation. Smith immediately initiated a high-stakes diplomatic pivot, leveraging his close professional relationship with Major General Freddie de Guingand, Montgomery's highly respected chief of staff. De Guingand was widely regarded as the most cooperative and level-headed British officer in the theater, making him the perfect channel for Smith's damage control efforts. Working in close coordination, the two chiefs of staff began crafting a unified narrative that presented the Oppenheim crossing not as an unauthorized competitive maneuver, but as a brilliant, pre-planned tactical diversion. Smith argued to the British High Command that Patton's sudden push in the south had successfully drawn German armored reserves away from the northern sector, directly facilitating the success of Montgomery's Operation Plunder. This strategic reinterpretation was a masterclass in bureaucratic sanitization, transforming an act of blatant command insubordination into a shining example of Allied cooperation. On the morning of March 24, 1945, Patton ceremoniously walked across the newly completed heavy pontoon bridge at Oppenheim. In a characteristic display of theatrical defiance, he paused in the middle of the span to urinate into the Rhine River, letting his staff officers capture the moment for posterity. Shortly after, Patton sent a provocative, highly irregular message directly to Eisenhower's headquarters. "I have just pissed into the Rhine River. For God's sake, send some gasoline." This message, while celebrated by his troops, was a direct slap in the face to the logistical staff at the Supreme Command. Patton was not just boasting. He was demanding that the Supreme Command immediately divert thousands of gallons of fuel from Montgomery's northern drive to fuel his own deep penetration into Germany. Walter Bedell Smith now held the explosive message in his hands, facing an ultimate to decide the fate of the Allied advance. Would he enforce strict compliance and cut off Patton's supplies, or would he yield to the momentum of the unauthorized crossing? The tension at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force was palpable as the message from Patton lay on the desk of Eisenhower's Chief of Staff. Patton's blunt, highly provocative demand for gasoline after his unauthorized crossing at Oppenheim had ignited a furious administrative crisis within the G4 supply apparatus. The logistical planners, who had spent months carefully rationing fuel and bridging assets to support Montgomery's northern drive, viewed Patton's rogue maneuver as a direct threat to the strategic integrity of the Allied advance. Walter Bedell Smith now found himself squeezed between the absolute necessity of maintaining command discipline and the undeniable tactical reality of an established American bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Rhine. To cut off Patton's fuel would strand the U.S. Third Army on a flat, exposed floodplain, leaving thousands of American soldiers vulnerable to a devastating German counterattack. Recognizing the immense operational stakes, Smith resolved to initiate a high-stakes bureaucratic shell game, quietly altering the G4 supply manifests to retroactively validate Patton's insubordination while keeping the furious British High Command completely in the dark. While Smith managed the paper trail, Eisenhower engaged in a subtle executive double game to preserve the fragile coalition. Officially, the Supreme Allied Commander had to maintain the appearance of absolute adherence to the combined chiefs' directives, which mandated Montgomery's assault as the primary effort. Underneath this diplomatic veneer, however, Eisenhower was a pragmatic military realist. In a later 1962 interview, Eisenhower admitted his complex, immediate reaction to Patton's call. "My first thought was, of course he did. My second thought was, how am I going to explain this to Montgomery and Churchill? And my third thought was, thank God George is on our side." Eisenhower understood that while Patton's tactical opportunism was a diplomatic nightmare, it was also an invaluable asset that could break the strategic deadlock. He quietly instructed Smith to absorb the political blows from the British, allowing Bradley and Patton to exploit the bridgehead while officially maintaining a posture of neutral, administrative oversight. With Eisenhower's tacit protection, Patton took his administrative circumvention to a dangerous new level. As his tanks crossed the Rhine, they began running dangerously low on fuel, threatened by the G4's strict embargo. Rather than waiting for Smith's staff to resolve the crisis, Patton ordered his division commanders to intercept and commandeer supply convoys from the communication zone, COMZ, led by his bureaucratic arch-nemesis, General John C. H. Lee. Third Army military police set up unauthorized checkpoints on supply routes, systematically diverting fuel trucks intended for other sectors and forcing them to dump their cargo at Third Army depots. This was a flagrant violation of military law, a move that Lee furiously reported to Smith as supply piracy. The administrative friction between Patton's combat headquarters and Lee's logistics empire threatened to halt the entire Allied advance, as units across the Western Front began reporting sudden, unexplained supply deficits. The fallout from Patton's logistical heist quickly reached the northern sector, igniting a firestorm of indignation. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was outraged to discover that his meticulously planned multi-divisional crossing, Operation Plunder, was being overshadowed and logistically compromised by what he dismissed as Patton's unauthorized sideshow. Montgomery complained directly to Prime Minister Winston Churchill, arguing that Eisenhower's failure to enforce command discipline was allowing American generals to hijack the strategic direction of the war. Churchill, who had already suffered the embarrassment of the BBC's premature broadcast of his triumphant speech praising Montgomery, viewed Patton's move as a calculated effort to marginalize the British contribution. Churchill contacted Eisenhower directly, demanding that Patton be ordered to halt his advance and consolidate his defensive lines. The Supreme Command was on the brink of a major political rupture, with the British leadership questioning Eisenhower's ability to maintain administrative control over his own forces. It was during this moment of diplomatic crisis that Walter Bedell Smith executed his most critical administrative maneuver. Acting as Eisenhower's political shield, Smith drafted a series of highly classified, masterfully worded cables to the combined chiefs of staff in Washington and London. Instead of defending Patton's insubordination, Smith strategically reframed the entire Oppenheim crossing as a planned, calculated tactical diversion that had been authorized under the Broad Front Doctrine agreed upon at the Yalta Conference. Smith argued that Patton's sudden breakthrough in the South had successfully panicked the German High Command, forcing them to peel away vital armored divisions from the north to defend the Saar-Palatinate sector. By presenting Patton's rogue operation as a vital, self-sacrificing support mechanism for Montgomery's main effort, Smith effectively disarmed the British objections. This bureaucratic sanitization was a triumph of administrative diplomacy, converting a potentially court-martial-worthy act of defiance into a textbook example of Allied operational synergy. At this pivotal junction of the campaign, what if Walter Bedell Smith had strictly enforced the G4 logistical directives, severed Patton's unauthorized supply lines, and demanded his immediate arrest for insubordination? Had SHAEF chosen administrative discipline over operational flexibility, the U.S. Third Army would have been starved of fuel and forced to halt on the eastern bank of the Rhine, leaving the Oppenheim bridgehead fatally under-reinforced. Historically, this would have allowed the German 7th Army to consolidate its defenses and launch a massive, coordinated counterattack against the isolated American infantry. The resulting military disaster would have fractured the Allied coalition, severely damaged American public morale, and prolonged the war in Europe by several months. Furthermore, a stalled American advance in the South would have left the path open for the Soviet Red Army to push much further west, radically altering the post-war boundaries of Europe and the geopolitical landscape of the Cold War. Returning to the historical reality of March 1945, Smith's administrative maneuver was suddenly bolstered by a terrifying new intelligence development. The G2 intelligence branch at SHAEF, heavily relying on conventional reports and selective ultra-decrypts, became deeply panicked by the rumored existence of a national redoubt in the Bavarian Alps. Allied intelligence analysts warned Eisenhower and Smith that the Nazi leadership was preparing to withdraw their remaining elite forces, scientific assets, and guerrilla units into a highly fortified, self-sustaining mountain fortress stretching across 240 miles of the Alps. While post-war scholarship has proven that this Alpine redoubt was largely an elaborate German propaganda myth, at the time the threat was treated as an impending catastrophe that could prolong the war indefinitely through a bloody, years-long guerrilla campaign. This intelligence panic played directly into Patton's hands, as his southern route was the only operational axis capable of intercepting and cutting off the German retreat toward the Alps. Recognizing a golden administrative opportunity, Walter Bedell Smith seized upon the National Redoubt panic to permanently validate Patton's unauthorized advance. In a series of tense briefings with Eisenhower and the combined chiefs, Smith argued that the threat of a prolonged Nazi guerrilla campaign in the Alps made the rapid expansion of Patton's southern bridgehead an absolute strategic necessity. He argued that waiting for Montgomery's methodical northern advance to clear the entire Ruhr Valley would take weeks, giving the Germans ample time to slip into their mountain strongholds. Smith's administrative shift was decisive. He officially authorized the G4 staff to release the hoarded fuel reserves and heavy engineering assets to the Third Army. By framing the logistics against the Alpine redoubt, Smith provided the bureaucratic cover Eisenhower needed to let Patton loose, transforming the rogue crossing at Oppenheim into the spearhead of the final Allied drive into Germany. With the bureaucratic floodgates finally opened, Patton's operational genius was unleashed with devastating force. The combat engineers of the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion and the 1135th Engineer Group worked in a continuous, sleep-deprived days, completing the construction of a massive 366-meter floating pontoon bridge at Neerstein in just 18 hours. Across this steel and canvas lifeline, Patton poured the heavy armor of the U.S. 4th Armored Division. The sudden surge of American armor shattered the remaining defenses of the German 7th Army, executing a rapid, relentless advance that bypassed localized strongpoints to strike deep into the enemy's rear communications. The German defenders, suffering from a complete collapse of their command and control hierarchy, were left isolated and impotent, unable to coordinate any effective resistance against the rapid American breakout. Patton's aggressive operational art, once restricted by bureaucratic red tape, was now turning the entire German southern flank into a rout. The spectacular success of Patton's breakout completely vindicated the broad front strategy over Montgomery's narrow front model. Within days of the Oppenheim crossing, the U.S. Third Army linked up with Courtney Hodges' First Army and William Simpson's Ninth Army, executing a massive pincer movement that completely encircled the German Army Group B in the Ruhr Valley. The encirclement trapped over 400,000 German troops in the industrial heartland of the Reich, dealing a mortal blow to Nazi Germany's ability to continue the war. The administrative justification for Patton's rogue crossing was now complete. What had begun as an unauthorized competitive stunt by an insubordinate general had directly facilitated the greatest encirclement victory in the history of the Western Alliance. Even the most skeptical British commanders were forced to admit that Patton's speed and audacity had shattered the German defense far quicker than anyone had anticipated. As the Allied armies raced deeper into the German interior, a new and final administrative crisis emerged: the race to the Elbe and the containment of the Soviet Union. While Montgomery's forces in the north crawled forward with their characteristic caution, Patton's Third Army surged eastward toward Czechoslovakia and Austria. This rapid advance created immense friction with the Soviet Red Army, which was pushing westward with equal speed. Eisenhower and Smith were locked in tense, daily communications with the Soviet High Command, trying to establish clear, recognizable boundaries to prevent accidental, highly volatile clashes between Allied and Soviet forces. Smith was forced to act as a geopolitical coordinator, drafting the administrative guidelines that would halt the American advance at the Elbe River, leaving Berlin as an operational prize for Stalin. Patton was deeply embittered by this decision, furiously arguing that the U.S. Army should push all the way to Prague to contain the spreading threat of communism, a suggestion that Smith and Eisenhower summarily rejected to preserve the post-war alliance. The end of hostilities in May 1945 did not ease the intense personal and administrative friction at the top of the Allied command. The Oppenheim crossing had permanently altered the balance of power within SHAEF, establishing the dominance of the American field commanders over their British counterparts. However, the wartime alliance was now replaced by the complex, highly sensitive realities of military occupation. Patton, who had been appointed as the military governor of Bavaria, quickly proved to be completely unsuited for the delicate administrative demands of peace. His aggressive, black-and-white worldview and his outspoken nature made him a constant liability for Eisenhower, who was trying to manage the highly sensitive denazification program and coordinate with the Soviet occupational authorities. Patton repeatedly sabotaged SHAEF's administrative directives, famously refusing to dismiss former Nazi officials from key administrative posts because he believed they were the only ones capable of keeping the infrastructure running. Patton's persistent insubordination reached a boiling point during a disastrous press conference in September, where he compared the Nazi Party to the American Democratic and Republican parties, sparking a massive public and political outcry in the United States. Eisenhower's patience was entirely exhausted. He turned once again to his chief of staff and enforcer, Walter Bedell Smith, to deliver the final blow to his maverick friend's career. On September 30th, 1945, Bedell Smith officially informed Patton that he was being relieved of his command of the legendary U.S. Third Army and transferred to the administrative obscurity of the 15th Army, a paper-shuffling headquarters tasked with writing the history of the campaign. Patton was heartbroken and inwardly furious, realizing that his refusal to submit to administrative control had cost him the only thing he truly loved: active combat command. In the final analysis, the historical legacy of the Oppenheim crossing reveals a profound truth about the nature of modern coalition warfare. While General George S. Patton remains immortalized in the public imagination as a heroic, larger-than-life warrior, his spectacular operational achievements would have been impossible without the silent, bureaucratic mastery of General Walter Bedell Smith. Smith served as the essential buffer, the administrative genius who managed the fallout of Patton's insubordination, placated the furious British High Command, and systematically manipulated the Supreme Command's logistics to turn a rogue crossing into a strategic triumph. Smith's ability to balance the absolute demands of military discipline with the fluid, chaotic realities of the battlefield allowed Eisenhower to preserve the unity of the Western Alliance while ruthlessly exploiting the genius of his most aggressive subordinate. This bureaucratic triumph proved that in the arena of total war, the pen of the Chief of Staff is often just as deadly and just as decisive as the sword of the general. Today, the fast-flowing waters of the Rhine River at Oppenheim run quietly past a weathered granite memorial block that marks the exact spot where Patton's combat engineers bridged the last natural barrier to the German heartland. The memorial stands as a silent monument not only to the physical courage of the infantrymen and engineers who crossed under fire, but to the invisible, high-stakes bureaucratic battles that raged in the corridors of SHAEF. It is a reminder that the ultimate victory in World War II was not achieved solely through raw, unbridled combat power, but through a delicate, often painful synthesis of aggressive operational art and calculated administrative science. The Oppenheim crossing remains the definitive testament to what can be accomplished when independent commander initiative is masterfully balanced against the unyielding machinery of a supreme joint command. If you were in Walter Bedell Smith's shoes, would you have strictly enforced the chain of command and halted Patton's supply lines for his flagrant resource hoarding? Or would you have exploited his tactical victory as Smith historically did? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.